Hello, good evening and welcome to this special edition of the Varlastan Circle. We're going to be discussing world building with a focus on World Ember special edition of the Varlastan Circle. We're going to be... And I'll remember to mute my Twitch. That always helps. So World Ember is part of World Anvil's calendar of events. They run a number of events through the year, and their December event is called World Ember, and the goal for it is to generate 10,000 words of new content in the month of December. We use World Anvil to manage the Varlastan setting. Those of you who've joined us for previous episodes will be familiar with my suggestions that this content will be available to you. And World Ember is my goal in terms of being able to get that in front of your eyeballs without leaking anything that the cast shouldn't already know. So with me this evening we have Eden and Dragon.
Hello, hello.
Good evening.
Who are hopefully going to ask me lots of awkward and interesting questions about what they've found in the setting so far. And hopefully I'll even be able to answer some of them without giving the game away.
Mm-hmm.
We shall see. For those of you in the chat, please feel free to ask questions about anything you've picked up in the setting so far, or anything we talk about here. Just remember, there will be things that I will decline to answer, because I really don't want to spoil some of the secrets that the cast have yet to uncover for themselves. So, I guess without significant further ado, what is Varlastan? We touched on this at the start. Varlastan is a homebrew world where, as far as the inhabitants are concerned, everything is perfect. The challenge for the cast is to navigate a world in which all of these things are true. And this has proven to be somewhat tricky so far. Viewers who have caught the first episode will remember that the party are recruits in the Order of the Circle, who have effectively been conscripted, and this is standard. Everybody gets conscripted, everybody gets trained in some useful ways, and then is dispatched off to grow as a person, and then ultimately to find their niche in the community, in order to ensure that they're all working together in the furtherance of the aims of the Circle. This is set out by local representatives, who the party have met one or two of, and different parts of the Varlastan world are responsible for different things. So they started out in Valipur, which is a very agricultural setting, and they've been moving out towards the foothills, and that's starting to be a little bit more interesting terrain. There's some more things going on there, and they'll find out a bit more about that if they head in that direction over time. So I guess really, Eden and Dragon, do you have any burning questions about any of the things that our party has seen to date?
Yeah, totally. If you've not got something, Dragon, I've got an idea.
Feel free.
Okay, so with the journey that everybody has to go on, the conscription.
Mm-hmm.
Are there famous instances or infamous instances, perhaps, of failures or successes of people that have become infamous through their deeds?
Yeah, there definitely will be a number of those. That's a really good focal point in terms of that community law that the party would be aware of. I think we did touch on that very briefly, very early on. I'll have to play back episode 1 and refresh my memory, but yes.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's hard to think back.
So as you'll see on screen, those who are watching the stream, all I'm going to do here is call out a whole bunch of bullet points, because this will then be my prep sheet for going into World Ember, which starts tomorrow evening. Okay, so yes, there are definitely going to be a certain number of people who are notable for their experiences on their loops. I've a sneaking suspicion it was the representative in the very first location who was chewing your ear off about a loop experience, but yeah, I'll go back and double check that.
Yeah, totally. Obviously, there are only so many bad things that are going to be tolerable. We're in a setting here where everything is good, and therefore anyone whose loop went very wrong because of something that isn't supposed to happen around here, that's liable to get hushed up. But that may also give rise to some rumours. So rather than being something that's openly shared, something that's spoken of quietly, perhaps in the barracks after lights out. Okay. Well, I don't want to pick your brain too hard on that, because part of me is kind of like, okay, would there be perhaps instances of or any kind of organized force within the circle for if there's a group that's gone off the path or in some way is in peril, would there be in any way a group that would perhaps be sent out to rescue them? Or I don't know, because there seem to be representatives of the circle along the path, as it were, and it makes sense that there would be. You would never be too far away from help, I would have thought.
So the answer to that is that there's almost certainly going to be something of that kind, but whether they would go out and help someone who was just having a bad time, or whether that's the sort of group that would deal with the cleanup if somebody went off the rails in an unacceptable manner. So that's probably a slight sideline into groups that are rumoured. Because, everybody gossips. There's always going to be a certain amount of, have you heard about such and such a thing happening? But that's definitely one where we can pick up, we can pick up a certain amount of what would be known in passing because you'd heard it spoken of quietly. So someone says something and is then quite quickly hushed, that sort of thing, without getting too far into what they actually are and what they're actually supposed to do, because those obviously the things that the characters are not going to know until they get further into the hierarchy.
Makes me curious if we could potentially run across the remnants of somebody's life or something, because I'd have to think that, say somebody were to fail in a rare instance, perhaps they're going to have family members and people that remember them, and there's going to be perhaps an echo of that
How do they... Like, do they have a particular way of smoothing over those cracks? If, someone's kid disappears while doing their loop, do they just say that they've settled somewhere else?
Well, it's not unheard of for people to die by misadventure during a loop. But the treatment of that would be very different from if they'd been turned upon by somebody else in their group, which would be the sort of thing that's unacceptable and gets hushed up very quickly.
It's the sort of thing where, if someone's been stabbed, for example, like, it's going to be very clear that it wasn't an accident. Like, does it mean that the body doesn't get returned? Or...
Yeah, I think that's one of those where it becomes very situational. It would not necessarily be easy to work out how much of that is known information or rumoured information, but it certainly can go on. I'll put it on my list, and then I can think about that a bit more.
I just can't help but imagine widows potentially, or parents more likely, I suppose. They've been given hush money potentially, or something like that. Or have just been magicked in some way and silenced by that.
Well, I was wondering more about the magic because everyone believes it's a utopia, and they really believe it. And it would be much harder for people to keep up a facade if they knew, or if some people knew it wasn't. Like,
limitation of
knowledge. A lot of
knowledge.
people to trust to keep a secret, potentially.
Yeah, the entire population would be keeping the same secret, which is fairly implausible. So but the characters wouldn't have any such idea.
On that front, with the whole, because we've kind of brushed up across the edge of the idea of like people's knowledge of history and how long has the circle been a thing. I remember one of us asking that was there any sense of anything that came before, and it seemed kind of murky, and like the circle has always been was the kind of vibe. And on that basis, what is the kind of limitation of like how many hundreds of years potentially back do people tell stories before things become truly kind of like no? And then that's the point where people just start saying, oh well, the circle has always been.
Yeah, that's a good shout, because watching that one backwards gives a lot of options for branching out into what effectively at that point becomes almost legend. How do you distinguish history and legend? It's pretty much by how well documented it is in practice, if not in a formal sense. Yeah, because it's definitely the case. I remember there was a number that I put on it. I forget exactly what it was, but it's several hundreds of years, and long enough that pretty much nobody has a lifespan sufficient to be able to give first-hand accounts, which makes it quite easy to change what came before. But yeah, I'll have to check back again. I don't want to create myself any paradoxes, so I suspect I'm going to spend a bunch of time reviewing old session notes and listening back to episodes, which is fine. I'm not going to remember what I said otherwise.
So for like this official history and timelines, we've not come across any children, I don't think. Is there like centralized schooling?
Yeah, that's a fair question.
Just because I think we haven't come across any.
Well, I can think.
And if you want people to learn like broadly the same worldview, you need to teach them it.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah, we've talked about how they're all schooled to a certain base level, and then they're given specialized training based on what they appear to have the knack for. But yeah, there haven't been any children in evidence so far that I can remember either. But equally, you'd spend an awful lot of your time going in and out of settlements at hours when children are probably at least inside, if not asleep.
And we go to the pub, so kind of makes sense we wouldn't necessarily run into kids.
Aye. But yes, it's a fair question, and there's quite a lot that can be developed off the back of that one for sure. The other thing I really need to do is get a proper map put together, which is not very useful for World Ember itself, but will be very useful for me actually making sure that directions are consistent. We definitely had at least one point where I got horrendously confused about how I described something in a previous episode and gave you bad information about your direction of travel. I had to correct myself.
Well, that's a lot to remember, and it is difficult week on week to keep everything in mind.
Yeah, which is why I think if I can get an outline map put together and then try and do something more useful with it, that will help me. And of course, it will feed into things like the plot point that we're waiting to resolve in the next full episode, where we have a map, or what we think is a map, but we don't have enough points of reference to be sure. So being able to make sure that there's some way for you to look at that and orient that for yourselves is probably a useful thing if we can get away with that a bit. Just trying to think what the I know what the other the other elephant in the room one is the worship of Almond.
Yeah.
That's an entire religion right there.
Probably most relevant for you, Eden.
Yes, yeah, because it's good, like, depending on where this all goes, could mean some major problems for a paladin.
Yep, you are by default a paladin of Almond, because they're the only deity available to you.
Well, we'll have to see if he's righteous and worthy of the worship.
Well, there was certainly some doubts over that in the last episode.
Aye, and one of the things that will be interesting to do is to make sure I pull together all of the threads that have woven in like that, because although I don't want to expand on them particularly, making sure that what you do know is already documented is a good start. A set of off-screen notes for things that aren't quite as straightforward.
On the, just off the back of maps and thinking about the general world, is there a major population centre? Is there like a capital, like the centre of the circle, let's say?
Yes, there is. have that piece of information. But there is a capital, which I definitely have told you, but isn't written down in my session notes, so I can't double check it.
Is that where we need to visit as part of the loop?
Yeah, you've got to go through it as part of the loop. Effectively, it's the way they register that you're not just sat in a field next to where you started for a year.
Oh no, how could we take the easy option?
I know. Who would do such a thing?
On that note then, given we've got to do a loop around the planet, would there not be like at least one other place on the other side of the planet that represents like a similar kind of hub, or maybe even a lesser version, like, but something that, I don't know, another check-in point of sorts?
So the map that you haven't seen, because I threw it together in paint just to orient my own head on how I intended this all to work. It's not that big of a world, particularly, and there's pretty much only one big enough bit of landmass for you to care about. And what it effectively does is it takes almost a cross. If you looked at it on a map, it would look something like a cross. But the long arms touch, obviously, meet on the far side. So there isn't really a significant centre on the other side.
Okay.
Valipur, where you start out, is probably a third of the way around the back if you were going from the capital and going direct straight around it at the widest point.
Okay. So along each, like, trying to think of how to put this. Given it's all one connected landmass, then are there climates? Are there like along these, I don't know, massive land paths? Is there poles? Is there, like, because this is like a magical world, there's anything is possible. What is there any variety on that front?
Yeah, there is. It's I don't think a fully blown climate is particularly high on the list, but there's definitely a full set of seasons and climate changes as you navigate the area. I can't remember if it has been said in a previous session, but effectively, if you went the other way out of Valipur rather than one that you did go in, that direction gets very marshy and then gets very tropical, and isn't particularly hospitable. And you know, there are definitely big elements of that sort of thing. And you know, if you go north or south, then you will fairly inevitably hit a pole at some point, and they are cold. It's not necessarily the most exciting of climates, but climate is hard enough to deal with as it is.
So would it be fair to say then that as life gets harder out towards these remote edges, that there are fewer and fewer people? I'm just thinking that, like, if anybody needed to get away from the circle or had an interest in that maybe the poles, just like throwing this out there as just a broad idea, that would perhaps be the place to go. provided you had the means to survive out there.
I mean, potentially. So, you know, one of the things you would definitely find is that some areas are going to be easier for people to hide out in. But of course, as far as the characters are concerned, nobody would ever have a reason to do such a thing. So it would be useful from a military perspective, but it's not something they would expect to have to deal with necessarily.
You say this, but I could imagine Timidar completely thinking along these lines.
I can imagine Timidar hiding under a snowdrift just to sneak up on you. If he thought he'd get a nap out of it.
It would be cold. He would need some warm milk afterward.
He would. It's convenient that he is some sort of wizard and can therefore warm his own milk at will. I think she's even made that point previously. If he hasn't, he probably should have done.
Okay. So, within the circle, like to the general populace, is there a sense of like these are people that are worshipped or respected, or like is there a general vibe to the way that the general populace reacts to the priests, or like who is in control of the circle? And I suppose is the other question that comes out of that.
So the general population doesn't really know. The circle is an entity as far as they're concerned, which makes some of the things harder to interpret from that point of view, but it's definitely something that I can explore a little bit, because it's useful to know what people do know about it.
I'm thinking in terms of like, I mean, we've interacted with a farmer or two, and would the farmers be kind of like, keep off my land, you authoritarians, or would it be more like, it's the priesthood, come in, take the bounty in the harvest and what have you?
Well, the thing is that they will all have had to do their loop as well.
Then within that, there's like, I suppose within this particular scenario, you could have particular situations where maybe a farmer needs their goods and the circle needs those goods, and you've got conflict that is born out of nature. And how do things go in that circumstance? Is there like outright fealty, or is there room to talk back to the circle?
Yeah.
Because we've played it pretty friendly in the way that we've approached people, I think, for the most part.
Yeah. Definitely.
But is that typical?
And I suppose even if it is typical, there almost has to be occasions where there will be conflict of some kind. That's just how people are.
Yeah, definitely.
It's the kind of, I'm just thinking like if the farmer so much as grumbles, does he go off to the re-education centre kind of thing?
How many lights are there?
How many turnips?
And are they purple?
I don't know, that depends if Kuji's been there.
Indeed.
So I know that it's it certainly does seem to be utopia in the sense of all the different species work together pretty well. Yep. I can't remember if there were other kobolds. because we were surprised at Kuji appearing, but I think it was more we pulled someone out of thin air. Like,
I think there are. Let me just have a recheck. Yes, there are other kobolds in setting. One of the fisher folk was a kobold.
okay.
Just that, in the session where you acquired Kuja.
The strange fish, which were completely and utterly natural.
But yes, there's under the guidance of the circle, all known humanoid and semi-humanoid species have developed the ability to work together. So, there's quite a lot of flexibility in that sort of way. You haven't seen some of the more niche ones yet, because you've really only been in fairly temperate, grassy, hilly sort of areas. There'll be some more interesting folk turning up as we get a bit further out. The sort of person that you will have perhaps heard someone say exists, but you've never seen one before. So that'll be interesting as we get towards that.
Given how far the fantastical sapient creatures can go in D&D, that could get very interesting. Yeah.
Yep. But yeah, pretty much it's to take a meta view of it. It's pretty much capped at anything that is classed as humanoid in the monster manual, and is no larger than large, which is quite a long list. Because I don't see any reason why they all have to be bad guys, and it's working fine so far. So we'll deal with it as we get to it. There is a list of at least some of those species already in my notes in World Anvil, but that's certainly one that's relatively easy to flesh out a little bit in terms of these are the ones you will have directly encountered, these are the ones you've heard about multiple times, and these are the ones that may or may not really exist, or they might be somebody playing a trick on you.
Are there any kind of professions, or I can't imagine that like the likes of a necromancer could necessarily find their place even within the circle, but I could be wrong. Is there a limitation in terms of like, because there are some pretty dark magics and things that would certainly in general terms put you into the kind of evil category? Is that a known quantity in any way, shape or form, or is it simply that that's unheard of?
So you would definitely see people using perhaps magic that harms another creature in order to defend themselves. Whether that, and that would be anything from casting magic missile to draining their energy, and some of those definitely fall into that traditional school of necromancy. It would be somewhat outside of the teachings of Armand to be raising skeletons or anything like that. Or summoning fiends from dark planes of uncertain origin. largely because there's no acknowledgement of any other planes existing. Which is, which immediately puts a dampener on a whole bunch of the more interesting standard types of magic. But yeah, necromancy is more of a... It's a lot more watered down in context here, because you don't have the ability to go around summoning a zombie horde to serve your bidding. It's really the use of necromantic spells as directly offensive options.
So if someone's magic showed a proficiency for necromancy, would they then be carefully steered towards something more useful?
It's not necessarily very common for specific types of magic to be trained.
Okay.
So it would be very much that they were trained as a wizard or a sorcerer. Although warlocks are something that don't really get discussed. There's no official position on warlocks, but if you don't have any extra planar, if you don't have any extra planar entities, who are you making a pact with?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah,
the answer
officially.
as to so many other questions is Armand.
And now we have these nice little jars with map pieces.
Indeed.
And hints of potential other deities that might be out there. Or something.
Something changed the entire sky. So if there isn't like a massive amount, so like when you were saying like the land is kind of almost cruciform and joined up, is there a lot of trade and activity in the ocean?
There's a certain
Like long
amount of
distance trade and
sorry, what do you say?
like long distance trade particularly.
There's a certain amount of organised activity, largely where there are effectively those shortcuts that make it so tempting. But ocean travel particularly is not very high on anyone's list. It would tend to be a lot more coastal activity, even if they do traverse quite a distance through it.
Are there any trade routes or canals, tributaries through the land masses to connect these locations?
There's definitely a number of trade routes. You've seen already on your journey that there are a whole set of well-organised and well-maintained roads that are suitable for passage by anything up to a small convoy of cars.
And presumably some of the rivers are navigable.
Yeah, the bigger rivers will be navigable for most of their lengths. The smaller rivers will, you'll trade down the size of boat potentially if you need to be dealing with the smaller rivers directly. But yeah, there's definitely plenty of inland trading options, both waterborne and landborne.
Is trade centralized? Is there a network per se? I mean, there's obviously the gold standard or what have you, but within that, is it the circle that controls the flow of goods, or is it a network of merchants? Is there a syndicate?
Yep, so the circle is ultimately responsible, and that is the sort of thing that's managed on local level by the representatives. So your local merchants will maintain a stock of certain things, and if they wanted something outside their usual scope, they'd be able to try and get hold of it. But there are no documented independent traders. Everybody's working within the circle's hierarchy and governance.
Okay.
What about communication? Like, the circle has to be able to get in touch with their people that are in charge of different areas, and pass information back and forth. Do they have any particular, like, fast communication, or do they send messengers?
Yep, that's a good question. I'm not sure how much the average person knows about that, so I'm not going to say very much about that just now.
I mean, from that I would then, and possibly completely wrongly, assume that it's not messengers riding back and forth, because I'd assume that would be at least generally known along with people that live along, like, the main routes, that they would see messengers.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to make that assumption, because if messengers were a thing, then there would be people who knew or who were messengers.
There's so many magical means of sending a message.
One of the big things in Varlastan is that the amount of magic that's kicking around for the average person is very small. But there isn't necessarily a hard reason for that level to be low. And certainly, I think at the level of barrack rumour, people who are far too good at magic go across to Spheris, which is the name of the capital city, and become part of the circle's outfit there. So it's definitely the case that some people are that good at magic or get that much experience at magic, and then they're removed from circulation in terms of being assigned somewhere else. But the average farmer will see an occasional bard doing some prestidigitation, and that'll be about it.
So on that note, like the prevalence of magic items, enchantments, I would have to assume is quite low. But would anybody have just like a small talisman or something, an amulet of luck or something? I don't know, something that's not too powerful, but is like a family keepsake, or would that kind of stuff just not be around?
I think I'll need to think about that more before I answer that one, but I'll put it on the list.
Not that my character's likely to go around looting people for this kind of stuff, but
It would feel quite out of character.
yeah. But you never know, disillusionment might come. We'll see where things go.
You've been told you follow a false god.
We'll have to see.
Yep. Yes, that's an interesting one, because for example, there'll be a certain amount of magical item use within the order. So, having been through training and been through a loop, everyone is likely to have seen magical items in use. But how frequently they are held within the general population is a different question. And what they look like if they are. that probably also ties into the into the religious aspect of Armand as well, because if it is, if that's fleshed out as where it's unacceptable to have that sort of thing, then that's going to influence the circulation of them. So yeah, I shall have to think about that one.
Cool.
Apparently I'm just off the edge of the screen, which is a little bit irritating. That's fine. Take that out. There we are. Let's start back up at the top of there again.
One screen done.
So I'm just looking back at the stuff I've put together so far. Yeah. So to go back to the description of the capital city. It's called Speris, it's the seat of the Circle, it's the headquarters of the Order of Unity, it's in the middle of a jungle. It's quite big. You know, they've built with the jungle rather than culling the jungle to make space for themselves to too great an extent, but it's not necessarily somewhere that people talk about very much. You know, it's far away, and everyone will have been there once. But you know, you passed through it in the pursuit of what was effectively your job at the time. You didn't go there on holiday. So you know, the level of narrative about it is quite different to what you would perhaps expect about what's functionally the only big urban area on the entire plane.
It feels as though, other than on their loot, the general population don't really travel at all.
That's difficult to travel when your job is to stay where you are and do the thing you're good at doing. But yes, I think it's reasonable to assert that there's very little in the way of distance travel.
Suppose maybe that if they want to keep people in one place, it might help that the loop sends you essentially everywhere that you have the option of going.
Aye, you know, there's not going to be any great wanderlust for that place you have never seen, because you pretty much you'll have seen all of it. Either you'll have gone pole to pole and off at least partly across the temperate belt, or you'll have crossed the temperate belt in its entirety and at least seen one of the poles.
Yeah, I imagine that could help with keeping people. I'm kind of my brain keeps going, but are they trying to control people and keep them all in the one place?
I'm
don't have
sat
any evidence of it being controlling. Just that, you know, this is the way things are done and people do what they're good at and people are happy.
Yeah, it's really where is the overt line between extreme organisation and coercion?
Yeah.
The question that I've got born out of all of this is, how do people form relationships on that basis? How do you find a partner? How do people then go on to form the next generation? Because if you're being garrisoned after a fashion in a particular place, is this then not some sort of like true population control, in the sense of like it's organized societies. Like the circle is deciding who will ultimately live in the same locations, and as such, what likely relationships are going to form.
Yeah, that's a good one to call out. To a certain extent, you're likely to find that within a barracks intake there'll be a certain number of personal relationships formed. It's very unlikely that a loop group would include any pairings from that, because that they're built up from a military point of view, and it's not necessarily the done thing. Whether that's the right way to look at it or not is a separate matter. But then once everyone's finished their loops, there's a certain amount of, well, what are you good at? Where are you therefore going to go? Who else is going to be there? Which is a little bit awkward to deal with, because you're correct to call out that if it's controlled too strongly, then it's effectively it's all predetermined. We need to look at that one in more detail.
Yeah, because I can't help but imagine that there would end up being unlucky individuals where, like, there's just an odd number of men and women of eligible age in the village at the right time, and the time passes, and there's old man such and such up on the hill, never found anybody, and it wasn't his fault. It was just that's the way that society goes.
I mean, if you want to look at human past as an analogue for it, that's exactly the sort of thing that happened.
Yeah.
But usually there's enough contact between small places that are close to each other that, okay, it might not be ideal, but you can find someone that you're happy enough to pair up with. And it being a societal utopia doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily mean that there's an emphasis on romantic love, because that might well not
True.
give outcomes that are favourable to the community at large.
Might not be a thing.
Yeah, and certainly from the different people you've met so far, there hasn't been a hard, all relationships must be structured in a way that makes it clear that it is possible for there to be a next generation from this relationship. But then I suspect I suspect this ties quite tightly into the question of where are all the children. Because
ultimately,
if you have a scenario where the act of the act of perpetuating the circle's population is separate from your personal relationships, then that gives a very different cast to where are all the children. I don't know what that's going to look like. I'm going to have to sit down and think about that one in some detail.
Suddenly sounds quite sinister.
Yeah, not least because I want to test the ethical boundaries around that before I make any commitments to what that actually looks like in setting. I don't particularly want to get 10,000 words into December and discover that I've just written something that I'm not prepared to publish. So
I can't blame you.
Yeah.
Oh, hello to the malted one.
Hello.
Hello.
Do people in this world have pets?
I'm always very, very low compared to everything else. Thank you, Malted One. Nobody else has said that yet. It's usually the first thing I hear when I get on a stream.
To be honest, at this point, we just kind of expect it.
It doesn't seem that whatever I do on any given occasion really fixes it properly long term. I'm going to sit down at some point and have a proper play with it.
It's because you mumble to yourself rather than speaking into the mic.
I try to avoid doing that.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's interesting because somebody said that to me the other week on a different stream through different software. So let's see if that downmix also fixes that. Yep. Yeah. So downmixing to mono fixes that issue. For some reason, my mic is only doing one channel instead of two. That's fine. I need a list of things I need to fix about the streaming setup. Never mind a list of things I need to do for Varlastan. There we are. I'll make myself a note. Yeah, it's almost like if it's not downmixed to mono, it's half as loud as it should be because it's only producing one channel. It's very weird.
So,
something for me to worry about through December when I have free time. Nope, it's greatly appreciated, Malted One, and please do sing out if there are any other weird things that you notice during the stream. Also, if you have any questions about the Varlastan setting, then please feel free to ask them in Twitch chat, and we'll try and answer them, or I'll put them on my list of things to answer over the next month. Forgotten where we'd got to.
I was about to ask if they're... it's our homebrew setting that Lunrwolf has made. We usually have a game every 2 weeks on this channel. So, super quick summary would be, Varlastan is a small world where everything is always done for the benefit of the community at large, including mandatory military service, and then you go off and explore and do good things for a year.
Yep, that's about the size of it. And while you're at it, your military service determines what it is you're actually good at, and then you can do that for everybody once you get back from your military service. The episodes that we've done so far are on YouTube, so if you feel like catching up on those and then firing some questions across on Twitter, then you're very welcome to do so. Or if there are things that we talk about while you're here and you want to ask follow-up questions about them, please just fire away. This is very much a Q&A session, and a lot of the time the answer is, I don't know yet, I'll have to work that out. So what were you going to ask, Dragon?
If people have pets.
I'm trying to think if we've seen anything that answers that question already.
I don't think we have.
I don't think we have either.
Not that I can think of.
It's a good question. I'll have to work it out. I don't think we really have a handle. I don't think we've really developed anything, rather, that says anything about that sort of small animal that you would traditionally consider to be a pet category. So it's possible, or it may be that there are more domestic utility. You know, guard dogs, cats for catching mice. That's about it. I'll have to have a think and see what makes sense in the context of some of the other things.
So far, I feel like a lot of the things that we've seen, like, into people's lives. So the farmer Pliska and at the tavern, and you know, where we're actually seeing like the domestic things, like how people live, as opposed to like getting orders from the circle and stuff. A lot of things seem to be quite utilitarian.
Yep.
So everything's quite practical.
Yeah, very much so. And yeah, you're correct about that historically malted one. The specific nuance here, which is why there's an unresolved question about it, is that when you come back from your military service, it's unclear how much autonomy you have about where you go and who you associate with. It's already clear in setting that what you are going to go there and do is determined largely by the training you've already done. But the question effectively was how, you know, if the party has seen two people in an established relationship already in a previous episode, how did they get into that relationship? Is it because they were both put in the same place, or is it because they had an established relationship previously, or did it happen by chance or migration? And the different possible answers to that give quite different looks to how regimented some of the bits of organisation are within the setting. It's definitely the case that the controlling organisation in the setting is in control of everything as far as the population know, but it's a question of to what extent, and that's what that's an open question that I'm going to need to think about so I can answer it without ending up with something that's morally questionable. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's the historical examples there are very much all of the above. So it's a question of working out what's correct for the way that the setting is constructed. There are a bunch of questions. So we've already cleared one screen full of questions. Unfortunately, it's not straightforward for me to keep them all on the screen because there's so many of them. But it's going to be very much a question of working through to make sure that it's internally consistent and also doesn't end up being something that you wouldn't want to look at. You know, as someone outside of the cast, it's important that people who are interested in the setting don't find it directly objectionable in too many specific ways. Yeah, and everybody in setting is under the control of that single central organisation, which is called the circle, and that's where the the party sit, so they are in the service of the circle because they're on their military service at the moment. So it's very much how that manifests and where that's going to go afterwards.
Just racking my brain now, trying to think of angles that we haven't touched upon.
I'm just reviewing the stuff I've got already written down to see if there's anything else I can flag up as an interesting thing. We've got Armand in there, we've got the organisations.
I've got a thought. Have there been any notable natural disasters within the history of the society?
Well, that's a good shout. That ties back quite nicely to the question about the documented history of the society, but
Because if it seems like this is a pretty controlled place in just overall terms, that the power of Armand could be unquestionable.
Yep.
And on that basis, if something were to happen, that would beg a lot of questions, and reaction to it would be interesting.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see how the population in general reacted to it, particularly depending on what sort of disaster it was that occurred. I don't immediately know the answer to that question. I'll need to look at some of the specific terrain features that I've sketched out previously and see if any of them are relevant, and I'll need to look at how things like the oceans interact as well. So we'll see about that. Yeah, Multibron, you're definitely right. That's a fairly straightforward way of managing it. It's not really in setting. We're not really handling it as a cast-like system. It's very much more an organisation that is both the government and the religion, and that is the one source of all authority in setting. So we're also looking a lot at how that manifests in the way that the people who live there actually interact with other people, and also with those figures of authority. So it's not, they're not a separate class at all. It's not driven in that regard. It's just that some people have the magic token from somebody else that says I'm in charge here. As much managers as anything else is possibly the way to look at it. But it's, there's definitely interesting parallels to be drawn from different types of human organisation. The natural disasters question, Eden, is really interesting, and that's got quite a lot of potential. I'll definitely need to think about that one in some detail.
Yeah.
I was meaning to ask earlier when you were going over like the terrain and the climatic zones. Are there like any major mountain ranges?
Yeah. So
I don't think we're equipped for climbing mountains at the moment.
Yeah, that's fair. So you're aware of the hills of Nar Ering? which are one of the big mining hubs. I don't think I've yet documented any. I haven't documented so far any bigger ranges. But yes, I'll make a note on that one, because mountain ranges are definitely the sort of thing that produce lots of peril or lots of opportunity to go the other way, depending on how you look at it. Let's see, where else have we got? Yeah, there's an awful lot of people for me to document. That's probably the single biggest volume of content I've got so far is the people that you've already met.
There's quite a few of them at this point.
Aye.
Had a good wander.
And you haven't even gotten that far.
Well, it's hard when somebody keeps falling asleep on us.
It's not Timidar's
Good
fault.
thing
He
it's
needs
a
18
cart.
hours sleep every minute. Sorry, Dragon, I spoke over you there.
No, it's fine. It's just we might need to find a cart to put Timidar in.
I'm totally down for that crib idea that I had. Strap him up on my character's back. Carry him around, weight training.
Will that count as him completing his loop, though?
After a fashion.
I mean, it's not judged on the same basis as a professional marathon, so it's probably fine.
Yeah, as long as he steps up when he needs to, it's all good.
Aye. Malted one. So the plane layout is something of a cruciform, so a cross shape, where the long arms meet on the far side of the plane. So there's a couple of oceans, one on either side of the of that long arm. And we talked a little bit, probably just before you joined us, unfortunately, we talked a little bit about the possibility of different maritime routes, what trading looked like on those seaways and things like that. But it's a good question, and please keep asking them. Yep. There's no harm in the questions. If I've already answered it, I'll happily answer it again. And best of all, if I answer it again and I say something different, hopefully someone will notice and tell me I've said it wrong. But yeah, so we've covered that there are some jungle areas, some marsh areas. There are some polar regions, and I think the only thing that is on my existing notes, and I didn't mention in the previous terrain discussion, is there are also definitely deserty bits. Large underground caverns. That's a good question. There's no fundamental reason why there couldn't be, especially because we've got perfectly well-defined mining areas. So discovering one would be pretty straightforward. I'll have to think about that one and see if that's something that does work in setting or not. My gut feeling is that probably does work. Whether it probably doesn't end up in the initial lore, because an awful lot of the information that I'm going to be putting together here is stuff that the characters would know in setting. So that would probably be something that went onto the list of stuff that stuff that is technically a spoiler when I decide yes or no to it. But I'll make a note of that. I have a separate list for stuff that's likely to be spoilers. In terms of access to the Underdark, there is no documented interaction between this plane and any other plane. So, as far as the characters know, there definitely wouldn't be anything Underdark related in the mix. But you know, there are already some suspicions amongst the characters that things might not be as cut and dried as they've been led to believe. So as things develop, that's something that might get quite interesting. I'll need to see what that looks like and how that can be dealt with, or indeed whether it's going to be dealt with at all. Because it might not be useful for there to be an Underdark equivalent, even if I want to start going down that sort of route. I might take a different approach to it. It's a good shout. Thank you for the suggestion on that one. Dear.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
From the malted one,
Yeah.
any special forests
Cool.
like World Tree or World Origin forest?
That's a really good question. So the capital city is set in a jungle. So that might be special. I don't think. Again, I think that's something where it would be quite tightly held knowledge if it was special. But if something was going to be special, that would feel like a really obvious one. It does really lend itself to the slightly wider question of where does this plane sit relative to everything else? And again, because there's no in-character knowledge of other planes, that's a hard one for me to answer for the world building for World Ember. Because I need to not have any spoilers in what I put out for World Ember. But it's definitely a good thing for me to consider, because even, you know, whether it's a forest, a bit of rock, anything like that, there's a lot of options there for how this tethers to other things, if there are other things for it to tether to. So again, I'll write that down off screen, because yeah, they're good ideas, and there's lots of extra things for me to work out how to approach. Because at some point it's going to be really important, and if I don't, you know, if inevitably the one thing I don't answer is going to be the thing that comes up and I have to make up on the fly. And that's fine if it's a little thing. It's not so good if it's something that literally defines the way the world works.
So with there being this distinction between knowledge and knowledge that most people don't tend to hear about, are there, I assume in Sparris there'll be some sort of library? But is there do the Circle have like their own store of knowledge that's separate?
Yeah, so that's a reasonable question. Tiers of knowledge are a fairly standard thing in hierarchical organisations like that. So that's definitely something where it's likely that the answer is yes, there is stuff that you can go and see, but what that stuff is may very well be limited. Yeah, and the other thing as well is tiers of access works really well, both for a hierarchical organisation and also for the way that D&D works, because obviously, you know, as you go up through the levels and you go up through the organisational ranks, they tend to work hand in hand. So that's definitely one where there's scope to make sure that there is something to look at there when they do get to Sperris, or any other time they get somewhere where they would have access to some additional information and see how that can be accessed. Yeah, definitely. There's almost certainly a library that's literally just, these are all the things that we know, and the only ones you actually care about are the ones that are specific to what you're good at. But but they're all centrally held, so if you did have a need to go and find that out, it would be possible. So that's quite a useful one to look at.
How do people entertain themselves just in day-to-day life? Is there like a culture of drinking? I mean, taverns and what have you are kind of the standard. I mean, is regular worship part of the deal? What do people get up to during their downtime?
It's a good question. We know that there are, at least in some areas, market days. We know that there are some taverns, but there aren't very many of them. You've been into a couple of settlements now. There's one pub. It's not a small building, but they haven't been packed to the rafters when you've been in there. What other things do people do for fun? Yeah, religion is almost certainly on the list, because it's tied in so tightly to the setting narrative.
Said about travelling bards earlier.
Yeah, that's a good shout. I did say that. Yeah, exactly that sort of model, malted one, or possibly one where material is passed around through those smaller areas. The exact way that a lot of that sort of communication happens is another thing that we touched on a bit earlier. We don't have a hard model for how people communicate over long distance in the service of the hierarchy, so that's another thing that needs a little bit of fleshing out.
With the bards, would the stories and songs that they would sing be like, would they be historical stories or allegorical stories, or what's the kind of, I don't know, because there's a certain amount of indoctrination that takes place with that kind of media,
Yeah.
even at that simple level. So would these be things passed down by the circle, or would the bards be kind of like free to do with what they wanted with it?
I suppose, without wanting to be too glib, the answer to that really becomes, how can you tell?
Hello, person Dynamo.
Annual festivals is a possibility. They would be quite localized, but that's definitely something that we can look at. In the same way as a market day, but that can definitely tie in quite nicely. Malted one, just to go back to your point about bard as a term, in setting, there are functionally no sentient creatures of any species that don't have a player character class. So, but Bard would typically be a bit too general, a bit too specific, but actually, because of the specifics of the setting, it's directly appropriate, because all travelling bards will be bards. The question is really one of what level bard are they, and you might not know that until you get on the wrong side of them. But yes, all of the bardic colleges, along with all of the other organised groupings, are directly derived from the circle in setting. Great questions, both from you, Malted One, and also from you, Person Dynamo. It's really useful to have the questions and have a few more things for me to think about. Except for the secret ones. Well, everybody is working under the remit and governance of the circle. So, as far as the general person knows, there are no secret societies. There may be rumours, we touched on this very early on this evening, there may be rumours about secret groups that work for the circle, but there isn't really something, there isn't the Thieves Guild that operates out of the tavern basement once a fortnight, because there are too many people to try and keep that secret from. That isn't to say that there definitely aren't any secret organisations in operation, but there's definitely not anything that anyone would have a general knowledge of, even in terms of stuff that's rumoured to happen.
Just while we're in a kind of lighter territory, I guess, are there any kind of like local food specialties or known products that are kind of like sought after?
There are almost certainly local cuisines, specialities, things you can only get if you are in the right place, in the right season. I don't know what any of them are, but they're a really good source of material. So on the list it goes, because there's an awful lot to be done with that. Because not only do you get what is the food stuff that somebody eats here most of the time, you get where does it come from? Where do those constituent parts come from? If it's a meat dish, what does that meat come from, and what do you do with it? Are there specific spices? There's quite a lot to get my teeth into there, as it were.
How?
But yeah, that's an interesting one because it gives so much option. Yeah, Malted One. That's the sort of thing that potentially there would be rumours about. I liked that as a reason for them to exist. So I'm going to literally steal your comment there and paste it into my notes, because you phrased that really nicely. But again, it's something where people aren't necessarily going to know about it without being asked specifically. So it's a bit of an interesting one. Let's see where that one goes. But yeah, having someone that's a little bit off to the side that's keeping an eye on things doesn't necessarily present a problem in that sort of organised setup. So yeah, I liked that. Let's see where that one runs to. yeah, College of Whispers would be the sort of thing I would be thinking of in that sort of vein. But it would, it would need to be heavily adapted for setting. But it's definitely a good shout. Keep them coming. all in favour of the interesting questions. Yeah, cruel things always exist. So Cuisines. We don't really get local customs particularly, because although there are the different temperatures, different climates, everybody speaks the same language, everyone has had the same education, and a lot of people didn't start out where they now are.
Mm-hmm.
Which will tend to homogenise your customs without actively trampling them. They'll just sort of not happen.
What would be the highest level of technology going in terms of, like, is there steam power? Are they anywhere close to that? What's the metallurgy of this? I don't know, society, I guess.
Yeah, it's a good shout. I don't know offhand what the top technology level is. The top known technology level for the general population is probably pre-Steam, but that depends on how people interpret things they see in Sperries and whether there are more things in Sperries than people see. So I'll have to think about that in a bit more detail. I don't think they've missed
my Tortle would be down for thermite bombs necessarily. We've got a mage or a wizard, sorry.
Oh yeah, and just on your point about Founding Day, Malted One, there is a question mark about whether there is any recorded history prior to the circle taking power. So if there isn't, then you wouldn't have a Founding Day, because the narrative from that hierarchy would be that it had always been the case. So you wouldn't be marking that unification point. So I'll have a think about that one, but I suspect that you wouldn't see any such day marked, because it would be counter to the narrative that they were already trying to push. I didn't realise we'd had thermite around for quite that long. But yeah, we're probably still pre-thermite, at least as far as the general population are concerned. I don't really want to deal with the wizard and thermite.
Is it at the level of clockwork? Like, is that conceptualized yet? That's kind of one of my thoughts as well.
I shall make notes, because I don't know why it doesn't like that. I have a little grammar warning about definitely post there. Oh well. It's definitely the case that a certain amount of printed matter is available, but that's fairly early on. And clockwork, I don't know about clockwork. There's a certain amount of finesse in there, where I think, at least in principle, you can get away with a lot less finesse if you're doing something like constructing a printing press.
Mm-hmm.
So really, I think clockwork is probably the point where the magic level is the important question, because if your high level magic in those important areas where you would do that sort of innovation is sufficient that you don't need to do physical innovation of that sort, you probably don't end up with clockwork. Whereas if it's a lot of physical innovation, then you probably do end up with clockwork.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it really is going to depend at that point whether those materials even exist in setting. In fairness, but that's a useful potted history of aluminium oxide there, and it's definitely useful and relevant to the discussion. I don't know how far down the line of I might let the wizard have thermite after all I want to get. But also
Would
calling out
wizard...
Sorry, Draken, go on.
Why would a wizard need thermite?
Because sometimes he runs out of spell slots.
Then you just need a second wizard.
We're not giving the wizard a clone.
Is there a social drive for technological innovation when some of those innovations are instead covered by magic?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. You effectively
Small scale.
Sorry?
So for small scale things that would be helpful day to day for people, for like everybody, maybe. But some of the big things, I would be expecting the circle to be involved with doing new roads, bigger things like that. So there wouldn't necessarily be the same need for the technological advance to manage big things, because they have all of the wizards and the sorcerers.
Yeah. And the other thing as well is, and I think this was touched on in the prelude, all of the higher level people are in Sperry's. So anyone who has the necessary, effectively anyone who has enough of a knack for artificing, for all that we wouldn't have a player playing an artificer in setting if I can avoid it, but there will be artificers or people using the same sort of skill set as artificers who are at a certain level going to be in Sperry's, working directly for the upper reaches of the circle, and those are the same people who will have enough of a technical inclination to be able to do that sort of innovation. So I think it's already controlled innovation to a certain extent, because if you're good enough at what you do, you want to be what you want to be is not the word, not really the phrasing. You are going to be in Sperry's working for the circle directly. But yeah, exactly how much innovation you do if there's lots of magic immediately at hand is a good question. There's always a trade-off there. Just to go back to the end of what Malted One was saying about aluminium oxide, the additional uses of aluminium oxide that you've described there are useful to call out, because when we're looking at the metallurgy of the society, how things like that are used actively in setting is very relevant. So that's something that I'll need to bear in mind. I don't want to paint myself into any corners with that right now, though. I'm just thinking.
It's a bit of a left turn, but do you think that there would be any kind of culture of violence in terms of fighting arenas, or even just like tavern brawls, that kind of stuff? Because in just general society, these things are going to kind of crop up, and it seems like it's quite a placated kind of society. So how would that be managed necessarily?
So there's kind of two things there, or I'm going to break that out as two things. So one of them, one would be violence for entertainment, in terms of arenas, etc. And the other would be effectively violent outbreaks, tavern brawls, fights in the street. You know, violence as conflict resolution. That is much more of a nature thing rather than anything else. I suspect that the answer to that one is definitely that does happen. You know, it doesn't matter how happy some people are. If the wrong thing happens or something sets someone off the wrong way, then particularly in a tavern, then you can quite easily end up with a violent outbreak. But yeah, you probably don't see a huge amount of interpersonal violence, as in the general sense, and a lot of that is going to be because fundamentally everybody knows everyone else has also been on military training. There's a certain amount of reticence about punching somebody in the face when you know they've been taught how to punch you back, and different personal natures is going to modify that sort of behaviour. But I think it probably is a thing, but a lot less common than you'd expect from human behaviour, certainly. And really, I think that's a combination of, because everybody's starting at the same level, and because everybody knows that everybody else can beat them up in principle. You know, bearing in mind that if you walk into a bar in Varlastan and there's somebody small and wiry, and not very strong looking at the bar, they're almost certainly a rogue, and they will mess you up. You know, that is going to lend itself to people agreeing to disagree a little more often than we'd otherwise expect, because people suck at that in reality. But we can write it out a little bit in Varlastan because of the way that the society is structured.
So, would it be fair to say then that your average commoner is not really your average commoner in any circumstance, because every adult will have done the circle and will have trained to a reasonable extent in some class?
Yeah, your average commoner is probably level 1 or 2 in player character terms.
So they've not necessarily done a great deal on that journey.
Yeah, not every loop is interesting. They'll have gained a certain amount of experience, but if they've literally stuck to the roads the whole way, they're not going to have learned that much. They can't all have interesting encounters with random white fish and kobolds that don't speak the language.
And visions of another world and a sphere breaking apart.
Yeah, exactly. Because if everyone had those happen to them, then you'd have known that was going to happen to you in advance. But yeah, where a lot of the time you look at the text, especially for D&D, and it says, if your stats are this across the board, you are an average human of level 0. The average sentient creature in Varlastan is somewhere between level 1 and level 2. And you are going to run into people who are a bunch above that from time to time. Usually those will be people who are within the hierarchy in the circle. But also you'll see the occasional retiree. Every district will know of at least one local who was a big shot, relatively speaking, and has come back to retire. And if you went and had a look in under the floorboards at their closely protected character sheet, it would be level 6 or 7 quite easily. But there's no easy pickings.
I like it. It's just interesting to consider in terms of if we ever need backup and there happens to be a village nearby. You never know.
Yep.
Time to come out of retirement for one more fight.
Right, well,
essentially,
Sorry, Dragon. One of the things to remember is that because you bear the mark of the circle, showing that you are in active service to the Order, you have the ability to call on the Circle's representatives for stuff, and that will in extremis include, can you give me a militia? I need to go and give that guy a chicken.
I'd be surprised if we bump into anything like that straight away, but you never know.
It's fairly unlikely, but it's much more, you're much more likely to need to use that influence for specific things. But in principle, it's absolutely the case that much like the Swiss Army, if you actually needed it, you'd be able to get hold of an awful lot of manpower, or person power, I should say, in a relatively short space of time.
Totally different point. Are there ruins? Are we going to come across deserted villages or anything archaeological?
I'm going to say that the answer to that is almost certainly yes, because I'm pretty sure I've already written at least one up. How ruined ruins actually are is probably one of those interesting questions along the edges. But there's definitely things like in the mines up in the foothills past Narering, you would find, and you would know that you would find quite a lot of mines, not all of which were still in use. They're not going to have just torn them down, they'll still be sat there. So in those terms, something that looks quite a lot like a fairly traditional dungeon, you're definitely likely to run across them. Whether they're interesting or not is another question entirely.
Okay. I was thinking about it because certainly in Britain and a lot of North and Western Europe, there are a massive number of deserted medieval villages, which usually have went out of use, either during a plague time or, pretty much mostly plague, because later on wouldn't be classed as medieval, like when the start of Industrial Revolution. But like you get a lot of them. So, like, if there've been population movements, do you have like some settlements that are now really small compared to what they used to be? And then that might come into conflict with what known about the history.
Yeah, because in much the same way, more recently than those medieval abandoned villages, there's definitely a few of them around. But if you go down into Cornwall and look at the old tin mining setup, there's plenty of ruined industrial stuff that's a couple of 100 years old and has been sat there abandoned. It's definitely there's definitely scope for there to be different eras of stuff, but again, that one probably ties into what the recorded history looks like and whether that recorded history is the entire history or not.
It certainly sounds like the alternative where that Kuji is from seems to have more unrest. Things seem to be more unsettled, so there might be more ruins like that. Like that was the only place that she could point out on the map. Like, we burned that building down when we were little.
Yeah.
But now you can lie there and watch the stars.
Yeah, I think the thing there is that there is a different flow of entropy. That's probably the best way to describe it without getting too far into spoiler territory. But that the way that the entropy flows differently means that it will present some things differently, and other things will be presented in similar ways. I can't write up very much about any of the stuff that Kuji is involved in because there's only so much that you've seen.
That's okay. I knew that wasn't something that could necessarily have much of an answer.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because effectively, I definitely need to write up all of the stuff that you've experienced there so far. But then I also need to make sure I've solved internally all of the things that you haven't seen yet. It's just annoying that I can't count those towards my World Ember count.
Oh no, he's always quiet. Always.
I am. I also found myself settling back into my chair a bit there. Apologies. Hello, Careers Agency. Thank you for joining us. We're talking about Varlastan setting. I'm doing a bit of Q&A. We're on to the third screen full of questions, which is why there's only a couple on screen. If you have been following the Varlastan experience, then feel free to ask specific questions about stuff that you've come across in there. Otherwise, feel free to just throw in random world building questions, and even if we've already answered them, that's fine. We'll summarise what we've said so far for you.
So I was wondering what the burial rites are. How do they deal with that?
Well, that's a good question. Ties in very, very, very directly to the whole Armand thing. But and
Feels
equally,
like it's something we might need to know at some point.
aye, more likely burial rites than any of the other fairly traditional lifetime events.
Mm-hmm. You never know, we might come across someone giving birth.
Yeah, could go the other way.
Help. Do a whatever an equivalent of a christening is.
Gotta wonder how far it would go with magic and everything, like easing the whole process.
I mean, that depends if that's included in the magic that's hoarded by the circle.
Yeah, goes back to where the children come from.
Well, apparently they don't, because we've not found any.
Not that we're actively out there searching for kids.
No, but we've been in a couple of places now. These children are all very well behaved. We haven't even heard them.
True.
Yeah, I don't think it's likely that you're going to run across somebody randomly in the middle of childbirth. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but I'm probably not.
It would suck for them. Yeah.
Well, that's the hanging
That's one of the possibilities that we'd touched on earlier. That may be the case. It may be the case that there's a more organised form of that. Or it may be the case that that's not how it's done at all. I haven't decided yet. Curious, no worries. So what the point of today's stream is that World Ember, which is World Anvil's December writing event, is about to start tomorrow, and I'm going to use that as the opportunity to try and document as much of the Varlastan setting as possible and release it publicly, so that people who are following our fortnightly Varlastan stream can read up on the background, or potentially take it and set their own games in that setting. And so what we're doing here is we're effectively going through a list of what about this, how does this work, because obviously when you have characters in a setting, they have a certain amount of base knowledge, but the players don't know all the same things that the characters will already know. So we're trying to flesh out what that looks like, and then that will be what is then publicly accessible. And then as they go through the continuing storyline, the additional stuff that they run across should then get to be public once that episode's been done. Hopefully that made sense. If not, ask some questions about it. So yes, burial rites, probably not christenings or anything of that ilk. You're probably not going to be called upon to perform any marriage ceremonies or equivalent. I mean, never say never, but I don't see it unless Timidar gets really keen on somebody.
Timidar would never trust anyone that much.
Oh, if only that weren't true.
I don't know. Might get drunk enough to marry somebody, I could see that.
Jacques would. Definitely. Yeah. Oh, under the cuisine, you should probably add in drinks, spirits for Jacques.
Yep.
Yes, fancy booze.
Yeah. Or alcoholic halfling.
alcoholic drinks, because Jack will want one of each.
Yep.
What's the predominant game animal in certain locations? Like, I suppose this links to the food to some extent.
It does a bit,
but it kind of begs questions of the biomes that we'll be passing through and what we can expect in terms of wildlife.
Yeah, it's definitely an important one. It does tie in very closely with the cuisines, but it also will tend to inform a lot of what else you see going on. Because obviously, if everybody in this area eats fish, you're not going to see any hunters.
Mm-hmm.
Equally, if all of the significant animals that are killed for food in this area are furry, then you're probably going to see furriers rather than tanners. Although I'm aware there's some skill set overlap, but you know, it definitely lends to adding a bit more character to a specific location. And there's extensions on that where different types of community will do different things because of relative levels of scarcity and things like that. So that's potentially got quite a lot of detail to get through on that one. It's a good shout.
We'll kind of make things interesting for the different trades, I suppose, where ultimately the traders are going to be some of the most experienced people in terms of just variety of experience, potentially. Heading along trade routes, experiencing different things. Whereas others, as much as they might have done their circle at some point, they might be longing for a dish that they ate when they went on the circle, that kind of thing, and they can't get it because they're too far away.
Yeah, that definitely makes for interesting possibilities, especially when we look back at things like how do they communicate over distance. You know, are the mechanisms for doing non-linear transfer of material? You know, are there teleportation circles, things like that? So that there's definitely some legs to that. Indeed,
That would have to be a privilege of rank, surely, given the way that things are kind of restricted magically, and it seems.
Yeah, you definitely wouldn't have any uncontrolled teleportation, but exactly where those controls lie is an interesting one, and how that's managed, what sort of form that takes. So that's quite a good one actually to call out here as well, because that, you know, it would be reasonably well known if there was an easy way of getting stuff from A to B, even if it wasn't easy to do it. You know, so someone goes, oh, you know, so and so was talking about this yesterday, and today here it arrived. Well, it's probably not a coincidence.
Blessings of Armand, maybe.
Aye. Armand was great. Was truly kind to you and blessed you with a sudden shipment of stuff from the other side of the plane. That'll be it.
Okay. Interesting.
But yeah, it's definitely some interesting scopes to throw into there. I'm just trying to see what else. Yeah, I still can't spot anything else hanging out in what I've written to date that really has a great deal to expand on. Magical flight, Melted One. That's a good question. I mean, in terms of the spell, obviously magic, as I think we've mentioned a couple of times, is somewhat controlled, and the higher levels of magic are restricted because all of those practitioners are centralized, but that's definitely available. Magical flight in terms of an item that would give you the ability, etc. I mean, probably, but that really ties back into the question of technological versus magical innovation. So it's a good specific to drill into to see how that balance is struck. And I'll write it down because then I'll remember to try and answer it. But
in terms of the wildlife, you said that was it that any sapient creature up to large size could be considered to be part of society, let's say?
Sapient humanoids.
Humanoids, okay. So are there like wyverns, dragons, things of scale that are in the sky in particular?
I imagine that there would be rumours, legends of things. Whether or not there are any that specifically exist, that's a slightly different question.
Yeah, I don't expect an answer to that necessarily, because that would give the game away to some extent. But yeah,
only if I was intending for you to meet one unexpectedly.
Yeah, if you look up in a given region, would you see? I don't know if you play Morrowind. Would you see like a cliff racer, something like that?
Yeah, I'm not sure what level, to what extent you'd expect to see anything. But it's definitely an interesting one to look at. Because they are quite a specific type of smart but not particularly interactive creature. You can negotiate with a dragon, but you have to start out from a very careful point. So yeah, that'll be one for me to try and work through, because the extensions on that are all things like, what about this sort of creature? What about this sort of creature? All, because there are several different sorts of types of creatures that are effectively intelligent non-humanoid, and how those are treated in setting, I don't think I've even started to think about yet. So that's definitely one for the list. Malted One, that I don't know how likely something like that is in setting, because a lot of magical items are very tightly controlled, but that's a really interesting possibility, so I've made a note of it off screen. There are definitely possible things there that could do fun and interesting stuff for the party. but it's not necessarily that likely that they'd run into something, because they're not spending a great deal of time fighting. I think they've had 3 combats.
Hard to think.
But yeah, something like that as an item that's held in one of the central stores. That's, there's certainly possibilities there, and I'll need to try and work out what sort of items they're likely to find if they did end up in those stores. Because, as usual, if you don't plan for it, it'll happen. If I don't work out what they're able to find, they'll fetch up in one of those stores unexpectedly, and then I'll just have to make it up as I go along. And definitely, if you've got artificers working at the sort of level that you'd be able to do clockwork, having a flight source means that you'd be able to put a machine together that would give you a functional flying machine. I still don't know if that's where the setting is going to tend towards. But it's definitely goes on the list as an interesting thing that may feature. Thank you for the suggestions on that one. It's greatly appreciated. Where are we? Flying creatures, other sorts of creatures equally. I'm not sure if there's any. Yeah, exactly. It's something that could happen further down the line. But I don't know how much I can tie that into the setting notes at the moment. But even then, it can sit on a list of secret stuff for future use when I'm feeling evil.
Come across some mad prophet artificer who's like, I am going to create this thing. Yes, sure you are.
Yeah. That also becomes more interesting in the context of the fact that there are these unusual things going on with Chuji and and this otherworldly stuff that they've experienced. So there's possibilities for creating havoc on all sorts of scales there.
If there's other places, then who knows?
Who knows how many of them there might be. But remember, there are no other places, otherwise you'd have been taught that there were other places.
Seen things now.
Well, exactly. You just have to work out who you want to tell about it. Yeah, Da Vinci is absolutely the template for that sort of thing. It's something that's quite a heavily used trope because it's really effective. But that doesn't mean it's a bad trope. So there's definitely some options in that vein. If I find myself looking for something to really gum up the works a bit, that's going to be quite entertaining to just mess with the party's heads a bit. Not that I would ever mess with my party's heads a bit. Honest.
Oh, certainly not. No questioning visions. Certainly not.
Definitely no magically multiplying glass jars.
Still can't believe Timidar threw one out the window.
He's a mad, impetuous swine.
He might be right all along. We'll see. Might be vindicated in the end.
I'm going to trust Kuji.
She's a little bit more open and forthcoming than Timidar is for a start.
Ooh, that would be interesting if there is something hidden that's not the circle.
That would be interesting. It wouldn't be something that was known about.
Yeah.
Malted one because everything is controlled centrally. So the circle would the circle will determine what people know about to a majority extent. At the very most, there would be a very vague rumor. Yeah, I think if the circle knew about it, they would have either embraced it into their ranks or they would have eliminated it. But it's not impossible for somebody to be sat outside of their reach, and in a way that makes life awkward for them. I don't want to go too far down that as a course of thought because that risks getting spoilery really fast. Because if I think about that too hard, then it'll be a bit obvious later. So that's another really good shout. I'm just going to make notes about that off screen where no one can see.
It's okay. I think we have an idea of just how devious you can be.
Yes, I know. I'm a sneaky and conniving GM at best.
Apologies if that came through the mic.
Nope. Was that the chat shouting?
Good. Nope, that was my hand cracking.
Lovely.
Trying to think of more angles, things that we've not touched upon in terms of the structure of the society and how it all works. Struggling though. We've
Covered quite a lot of ground.
Yeah.
We have. It's been pretty extensive actually. There's quite a lot. There's quite a lot here that I'll then have to go and sort back through and make sure I understand it all. And then I'll be able to start using it as writing prompts. But it's been really productive, for definite. I quite like that as a tweak on it, Malted one. It's that would definitely be entertaining. And there are lots of ways to twist that. We'll see what comes up, what I come up with over time. That's definitely a good call. If we run another one of these, I hope you turn up because you've got loads of good ideas. Oh, yeah. Let's see, anything else on my list of things? We've talked about the species, we've talked about some of the other bits and pieces.
I have a extension on the, well, instead of like the flying creatures, are there any venomous creatures?
Yep.
Like I know we can expect that there will be some creatures that can harm us, and that's partly why we get military training.
Yep.
But are there things that we like we don't have, as far as I'm aware, we don't have anti-venom for anything. So are there like scary things that you just cannot get bitten by this?
Yeah, that's a good question, because obviously the standard-ish set of monsters, you have a whole bunch of things that will inflict a poison status, which is functionally venomous. But you don't particularly have very many that will inflict a poison status that won't go away. And those, those are the ones you want to make sure you know what they are, so you avoid them.
I mean, the classic for it would be some snakes and lizards with venom.
Yep.
But you can have pretty much anything, really. And platypus has
scorpions
has venomous spurs.
Yeah.
So
scorpions are a similarly good shout for that sort of thing.
Spiders, of course.
Yep. Yes, all spiders are venomous. Yeah, exactly, Malted One. Venomous is the correct real world terminology for it, but in D&D you're right, they collapses all down into poison, which is a bit unhelpful from that point of view, so we just have to muddle along. But yeah, and it's not it's there's lots of different places you can encounter a venomous creature, so that makes life more interesting as well.
And there tend to be, well, in real world there tend to be more in warmer climates, and there's quite a large temperate zone from what you said earlier, so
I'll need to go back over and make sure that all of my different climate bit notes are accurate, because I'm sat here thinking about the different climatic zones, and I think I described them wrong earlier, so I definitely need to make sure I've got that written down properly, otherwise they'll stay poorly defined. That's a really interesting character concept, Malted. That's quite the quirk on that.
that is fantastic.
Yeah.
But the thought of milking centipede venom is horrifying.
Better than milking pigeons.
But centipede venom is horrendous. It's so bad.
Well, yes. Just trying to think if we've touched on anything in an episode where we really haven't really covered it in enough detail, but I think anything that is likely to come up there I've probably already got in my notes from that episode.
I'm really struggling myself at this point to think of anything else. We've already covered a lot.
We've been running through this now for more than 2.25 hours. That's quite a lot of world building time. So I think we can probably look towards a wrap up. If anyone in chat has any more questions, please sing out. I'm more than happy to keep answering questions, but if we're running out of them to ask, then any more questions will need to come from you folks. How prevalent are pirates and/or ninjas? Oh, the two traditional character classes. Piracy isn't a thing, in much the same way that any other sort of unofficial activity isn't a thing. Ninjas, that's a separate question. There's no documented information about ninjas, but you might never notice until they step out of the shadows and stab you.
I mean, do rogues count? Is ninja actually a separate class? I don't know my D&D well enough. I'm terrible.
I suspect off the top of my head that ninja is probably only available on DM's Guild. If even there. It's not the sort of class concept that I think they would be releasing for 5th edition. Just because of the nature of it and the connotations of it.
Yeah, it's a bit culturally loaded.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on, Malted One, and I will very pointedly make the note, because you never know your luck. And we shall have to see what develops. Equally, that might be something that ends up in the pre-history section. You know, there might be some perfectly interesting tales to tell there that have got nothing at all to do with the circle's rule, but we shall have to see. But yes, I think that will probably cover us for today. I've got any amount of stuff to go and write up. It's going to keep me very thoroughly occupied. Yeah, absolutely. Piracy is either a tool of quiet war or a tool of rebellion.
Or desperation.
Mm-hmm.
Aye, the line from the government's point of view between desperation and rebellion is pretty much nil. In fairness,
True.
You're either a pirate because the government said you could be, or you're a pirate against the government. Even if you end up mainly preying on merchants rather than governments directly.
Is there massive social inequality? Because that's the sort of thing that fosters bandits and pirates and those sorts of groups. But if things are largely equitable, it's much less likely.
I think the thing is that things aren't necessarily as equitable as they might be, but everybody is happy with the amount of equitable treatment that is given out.
I suppose if you have enough and you don't need to be massively concerned about starving, for example,
Yeah.
then that might be enough.
Yeah, exactly. If you have everything you actually need, it doesn't matter if somebody else has more.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly if they appear to need that. You know, in real world terms, that's why you would do a universal basic income per head rather than anything else, because if it fits all of your needs, then that's the point of the exercise. But yeah, and I don't think there's any basis for social inequality to be a flashpoint issue.
Okay.
And I think that there's probably a paper in that. in terms of this is why social inequality in this setting isn't a big deal, even though it's there, but nobody cares because they've got what they need. That's probably something that you could probably write quite a lot about if you had the terminology. I definitely don't, so I'm probably going to leave that one. But no, everybody has everything they need, and if there's a problem, then they can get it solved. Pretty much covers off all of the reasons why somebody would push back against the government, other than pure idealism. As Malted One just pointed out. But in setting terms, there isn't an option of not living under a government, so that viewpoint doesn't really come up either. There isn't an alternative available to try and follow. Everything is tied into the circle and the state religion. But then if you've been trained from a very early age to be happy with the way things work, then you wouldn't look for freedom of choice there.
It might also help with that, like, with your military service and your loot, you then can work out both what you're good at and what you want to do. And to an extent, the circle will make that happen.
Yeah,
you choose where you end up.
Yeah.
So that might...
Yeah,
I imagine that would cover a chunk of that for most people.
Yeah. Your training is geared towards what you are innately good at, but that doesn't dictate what you're going to do after your military training. Completing your loop does give you a certain amount of freedom to work within the confines that are put on you by the circle's existence. So that really does. It provides the illusion of choice, if not actually a great deal of choice. And a placid population are likely to accept the illusion of choice as sufficient. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up there. Yeah, the answer on that one, Malted, would be very much it doesn't happen. And if it does happen, it's one of those things that is dealt with very much quietly and very quickly, and is never written down anywhere. Dealt with quickly and firmly enough that there's never even a rumour that sort of thing happens. Because having that rumour would be enough to threaten, from a certain viewpoint, the stability that's inherent in everybody being fine with things as they are. Okay, let's see who I don't have any more things on my list of things to worry about. If we're trying to get this together, there's going to be dozens and dozens of articles for me to write on this one, so that's going to keep me out of trouble. So I think we're going to call it there. I'd I'd like to thank those of you in Twitch chat for contributing. The questions have been hugely valuable. Malted Ron, you've asked loads of questions. That's been great. It's really appreciated. And Curious, thank you for jumping in with a couple of points. And Person Dynamo, thank you for asking about festivals earlier on as well. I've been Lunrwolf. You can find me here on Twitch. You can find me on Twitter. You can find Penance RPG, obviously here on Twitch. You can find us on Twitter as well. You can find us at Dragon Meet in London if you happen to be a UK person. That's on Saturday, and we'll be there. And if you want to know anything else about the Varlastan setting, anything about the games that we're running here, any of that sort of thing, drop us a message on Twitter and we'll pick it up and come back to you. I'm going to ask Dragon to find us an appropriate raid target. We'll bounce out and close this down for the evening. I don't have any raid targets, Dragon, so please feel free.
Probably Vet. He's the...
Yeah, it's all good.
Because it's Nikolai that runs the Twitch channel, usually, I get a little bit lost and confused. But I think we shall raid into Vet.
Sounds good. Thank you all again. Thank you to Eden and to Dragon. And we'll see you again soon.
Bye.
Good night.
What are you doing? You step out here a minute. I got a shower.